Topic Notes 4.1 Energetics of Marine Ecosystems. This is where we're going to really talk about photosynthesis and chemosynthesis and even respiration in there as well. And of course, there are photosynthesizers or primary producers in the ocean. You are looking at one now, and no, it's not the seahorse, it's the seagrass that's actually poking up around the seahorse. This picture is actually from Blue Heron Bridge, where you actually do have a decent population of seahorses, and they are just one of the organisms that rely on seagrasses as a habitat. And of course, seagrasses are not only a habitat, but they're also primary producers. So let's get into it. So the main idea here involves energy and the ecosystem. So energy flows and transfers through the marine food web. It is governed by the laws of thermodynamics and controls productivity within a given system, specifically the marine system that we're going to be studying. So once again, here are your learning goals. And again, just remember they are reflected on your learning scales and you are responsible for them. So definitely remember to check them out as you move along. So let's get into the weeds. We'll start with energy. What really is it? Well, energy is defined as basically the ability to do work. And energy is, and we could get into this in terms of physics and whatnot and electrons bouncing around, but we're going to leave that to another time and place. For the purposes of this class, we'll just define energy as basically being able to do work, and it's transferred through an ecosystem. And it's transferred based on two laws. The first law is the first law of thermodynamics, that is that energy in an isolated system can be transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. This is also called the principle of conservation of energy. Now, beyond the scope of this course, this is a big universe-defining concept. What it means is that all the energy available in our universe right now, that's all we have. And that includes every star, including our sun, everything, all the energy. So you might say, well, if energy can't be destroyed, then what happens to the energy that's running through my, the light bulb in this room right now, that kind of thing. The energy keeps going into the light bulb, and if we turn the electric switch off, the light goes out. So what's going on with that energy that's coming out of the light bulb? Well, that has to do with the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy within an isolated system, not in equilibrium, will tend to increase over time. It's often just called the entropy law. So then that comes to the question, what exactly is entropy? Well, entropy is generally considered the measure of the disorder of a system. And really, in terms of the universe, things tend to get more and more disorderly over time, especially when we talk about energy. So energy, in terms of disorder, would be like heat. Heat is basically just molecules bouncing around everywhere, not really being useful. Now, we tend to use concentrated forms of energy to produce work. Now, through fossil fuels, we've revolutionized our entire human population in the last 200 years or so. We take very high concentrated energy stored in fossil fuels, burn it, release that energy, boil water, turn turbines, do all that kind of stuff to produce work that eventually will create electricity. But once that electricity gets to a light bulb, it will dissipate out into the room as useless heat. We can't go collect the heat in the room, store it back up into coal, and burn it again. It doesn't really work that way. Hence the problem with relying, of course, on fossil fuels for the rest of human, existence. But both of these laws have very dramatic impacts on how energy flows throughout an ecosystem and through a food chain. And that's what we're going to concentrate on. So here's a little diagram to explain this. So you input energy into a particular conversion process, which would, in the course of talking about human and energy, you could say a power plant, for example. You're going to get useful work energy out of it. And of course, you're going to get heat radiating off into the environment doing nothing. Now, in terms of really large-scale concepts universe-wise, entropy just will continue to increase in the universe until the general temperature, the overall average temperature, will continue to decrease to probably close to absolute zero, but not completely. And that's because all of the energy will still be there, just like it was early on in the universe. It's just going to get spread out to the point where we're going to get really cold. But luckily, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So let's move on and really concentrate on what's happening in the environment. And in this particular instance, we need to start talking about the processes that capture energy from the sun and convert it into something useful for living things. You know what that's going to be. Yep, that's right, your good old friend photosynthesis. Yay! So by now, in your educational career, you should have a pretty good idea of what's going on with photosynthesis. You take plants, producers, take carbon dioxide and water and light energy from the sun. They combine all this stuff and produce glucose, water, and oxygen. So down below there, you see the balanced equation. And I do expect you to know the inputs and outputs of photosynthesis. You don't have to write the balanced equation, although it's not a bad idea to understand these things, especially if you plan on moving on into science. But you definitely need to understand what goes into the equation, what comes out of the equation. Now, chlorophyll is the green pigment found inside plants that allows them to absorb this energy from light and continue on with photosynthesis. This actually is going to be a useful term for us when we talk about global marine productivity in another lecture. The key thing to think about here is that photosynthesis produces the raw materials for plants to create biomass. Now, on land, that's pretty obvious because you get grass growing, you get trees growing. That's all a lot of biomass. In the marine environment, we do have some actual honest-to-goodness plants, some seagrasses and mangroves, but a lot of times we're talking about things that are very small, but it is still the same concept. Glucose is used to go through cellular respiration and also to continue to add on to the body and make a bigger mass, if you will. Oxygen, of course, is produced during this process, but one thing people often forget is that plants do go through cellular respiration and use oxygen just like animals. If you set a system up where you have seagrasses in it and you monitor carbon dioxide and oxygen levels during the day and night, you'll see that fluctuation. You'll see that, O2 is being produced and it goes up during the day. CO2 is being produced as well. But at night, all of a sudden the O2 levels will drop and CO2 levels will continue to increase. And of course, that's because the plants are not consuming CO2 at that point, and they're not producing O2, but they are producing carbon dioxide. Now, in terms of photosynthesis in the ocean, it's probably pretty obvious, but I'm going to state it anyway. You can only go through photosynthesis when light can penetrate to the depth of wherever that primary producer is. And we call that the Photic Zone. And as you might know, the deeper you dive down, the less light there is. Well, eventually you're going to dive down to a depth where there's not enough light to go through photosynthesis. It's actually called the compensation depth, but a whole other thing. But either way, it's there. And it's something we have to pay attention to when we talk about productivity in the marine system. Therefore, almost half of the marine productivity that occurs in coastal regions, and it tends to be above continental shelves. Now, as I've alluded to already, our primary producers in the marine environment are the really small things, mostly the phytoplankton, which account for 99% of primary productivity in the ocean. Now, we also have seagrasses, mangroves, and macroalgae and whatnot in coastal regions specifically. However, again, phytoplankton is pulling the bulk of the weight. Also, don't forget, we have symbiotic zooxanthellae algae that live inside the tissues of corals. And if you don't know what that is yet, we're going to get into it quite a lot this year. So now we're going to start focusing in on factors that affect photosynthesis in the ocean. And the first sort of category we're going to look at is temperature and carbon dioxide. Temperature is really a bit of a lesser factor, and this really is due to the fact that it's relatively stable within the ocean environment. And when we studied chemistry, hopefully you have an idea how that works. Carbon dioxide is also an important component of photosynthesis. So that is needed for the process. And so its presence is obviously important for photosynthesis to occur. Now, to a much larger extent, nutrients are a big factor. And we're going to talk a lot about that throughout the year. Algae and plants require nutrients in order to grow. They get nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that out of it. So anytime you have a lack of nutrients, you can have a lack of productivity. This graphic is actually showing you areas where you have high chlorophyll concentrations in the ocean, which are generally aligned to high productivity and high nutrient loads. And so we can actually graphically look at this on a global scale and a local scale. It goes without saying that you need light for photosynthesis. And obviously, the deeper you go in the ocean, the less light you have, hence the term the Photic Zone, which we used before. So photosynthesis can generally occur somewhere in the neighborhood of down to around 200 meters of water or so. Now, the depth of which this can occur really depends on a lot of different factors. The absorption of light by water, the reflection from suspended particles, latitude, season, things like that. Now, not all of the light is going to penetrate to that depth of 200 meters. If you've ever seen pictures of the ocean or underwater, you'll notice that it's very blue underwater. That's because blue has a very short wavelength in terms of light, and it tends to be able to penetrate deeper than, say, red, which has much longer wavelengths of light, and it gets usually filtered out in the first few meters of water. Density is also a factor. As sunlight is absorbed by water, it's going to increase the temperature of the water, and thus decreasing the density. Now, this warm, low-density surface water is going to help to keep phytoplankton near the surface, where, of course, they are going to generally photosynthesize a lot more frequently just due to the amount of light that's around. Colder, denser water tends to be below the thermocline or the pycnocline, and it tends to trap nutrients. So there's two things going on here. You're first keeping your photosynthesizers up towards the surface, but you're also trapping your nutrients kind of separate from the photosynthesizers. And of course, there are methods in which this can cause turnover and nutrients can come up to the surface, and we'll get into that as well. So that leads us to the term deep chlorophyll maximum, or DCM. It's the point near the thermocline where the productivity is the highest, as there's enough light from the surface, yet there's still nutrients from the deeper water. On the graph to the right, you can see where the chlorophyll maximizes out in confluence with nutrients, temperature, and irradiance from the surface waters, and that is the DCM. Now, I've kind of hinted that there is an exception to the fact that all the energy in ecosystems comes directly from the sun. And here's the exception. It's called chemosynthesis. And chemosynthesis is a process that's very much like photosynthesis. Certain bacteria in very deep ocean habitats basically produce energy through oxidizing inorganic substances, specifically things like hydrogen sulfide. And they use that process to synthesize organic compounds, specifically glucose, sugars. This is done completely without the sun, in a manner of speaking. It does, however, rely on the heat produced from the interior of the Earth. So hydrothermal vents rely on kind of really superheated water that dissolves some of the various minerals and such within the bedrock. And that releases kind of relatively toxic chemicals such as hydrogen sulfides into the water. And as it hits that cold water, it precipitates and actually starts to form these chimney formations, kind of like stalactites and stalagmites in a cave on land. But some of the chemicals that are released are used by bacteria through the chemosynthetic process, and it starts an entire food chain. The bacteria, of course, feed other organisms and so on and so forth, and it creates this quite unique deep sea ecosystem. And we're talking thousands of feet down. I think the deepest was found around 16,000 feet. It's not uncommon to find them at 10,000 feet, things like that. So the kind of mind-blowing thing about this, and I keep talking about the universe and space and stuff, but Europa, which happens to be a moon of Jupiter, it's an ice moon with a liquid ocean underneath it, at least we believe it is because of all the fracturing on the ice's surface. If that's true, there's some sort of geothermal heat going on there to allow a liquid ocean underneath that ice. And if it is, could chemosynthesis create an entire ecosystem down there on that moon? Now, of course, the challenge is how do we find out? Well, we'd have to have a probe go out there and actually be able to drill through the ice and then go to the ocean floor there. Very, very tricky engineering feats to accomplish, so we haven't done it yet, but believe me, scientists are thinking hard about it. Meanwhile, back on Earth, we have something called cellular respiration, kind of the opposite of photosynthesis. And again, this is something you guys should have seen before. I expect you to know the inputs and outputs of the process. You know, you have glucose going in and oxygen going in and water, and you're going to get out carbon dioxide and water plus usable energy that you're going to use to run life processes and, you know, do everything you do as a living thing. So we know energy enters through the sun and, of course, photosynthesis. Once it gets into that first trophic level, stuff starts to happen, like cellular respiration and, of course, even plants adding biomass. All of that is going on. Now, only about 10% of the energy from that first trophic level is going to make it up into the second trophic level, which of course would be your primary consumers, your grazers. From there, you only have about 10% of that available energy that moves up into the third trophic level. So all of this loss is generally lost through heat and through biological processes of the organisms that have that energy at that particular trophic level. Now remember, this all comes down to the second law of thermodynamics, which is the entropy law. As complex systems go, entropies increase, energy does not transfer efficiently, and thus it is lost as heat throughout the system. Now when we talk about marine systems, they tend to have a few more trophic levels than terrestrial systems, usually about 5 to 7. In terrestrial systems, you usually only see about 3 or 4 tops 5. Now, why is that? What's going on? Well, here's the deal. Every trophic level is dependent on the amount of energy available to it from the one below. So if only 10% of the energy is moving up at any one given level, by the time you get up to 3, 4, 5 levels, there's not much energy left. Now in the ocean, because phytoplankton, for example, are pretty much completely consumed, unlike maybe plants on land where you're just eating the leaves, that's complete transfer there is much higher compared to land. And that transfer allows a few more trophic levels to sort of be added on or tacked on to the end. But there is a finite limit to how much energy there is, and that limits the population of big predators like sharks or killer whales or whatever you're talking about, the larger fish. When you were younger in school, you probably talked in terms of the big predators, like, well, if there were too many lions, then they'll take out too many gazelle and there won't be any gazelle left. Well, in truth, that is what ends up happening, but it's not from the top down. It's from the bottom up. It's from the available energy resources that filter up through the different trophic levels, limiting those top consumers. And that's where we're going to end today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for a bit of a challenging in-depth question. I want you to write out an explanation about how the first and second law of thermodynamics applies to the trophic structure of an ecosystem. Do the best you can and keep on thinking.